Alright everyone, welcome. We're going to take a look at a gouache and colored pencil demonstration. And I'm using a reference photo from Howard Lyon, who is a great artist himself and uses reference photography a lot. So if you like the look of this particular image, it's part of a set that he's put together focusing on the motion of a dancer. I've selected the portrait because I like the camera angle and the sense of light that it has on it. So we're going to speed this demo up, and I'm laying this in on gray paper. It is a thicker gray paper that allows for some wet medium to be applied to it. And I'm going in with an HB pencil to rough in the construction of the head so that I have a good roadmap. So you can see I'm cutting into a bigger form and pulling the brow out and introducing the nose and the plane underneath the nose, making marks going up towards the tear duct and building the eye outward, and coming down off of it and building the mouth now off the nose. All in all, this demo took about 2 hours to complete. It's sped up to just under half an hour, and about half of it will be dedicated towards gouache painting, and the other half towards tightening up the painting with some colored pencil. Everything here is a comparison, and so I'm never finalizing anything until I specialize a big interpretation of the whole picture, whole face, and then I get in and get a little bit tighter. So I'm more confident with where the placement of the features are. I can go in here with the nostrils now. But the whole time I'm looking at how it relates to other things, corners to corners. Being sure here to look at the mouth as if it's on a cylinder going away from us, and rounding over that volume. Now the shapes of the neck, I'm looking at the pit of the neck and drawing the sternocleidomastoid down behind the ear and connecting down towards by the collarbone. The rest of the forms under the jawline are very soft, curved forms. I'll be keeping an eye on that to make sure that they don't garner more attention than they need. They need to sink under and feel a little bit softer. Continuing to reference one side to the other to make sure perspective is correct. Drawing elements kind of cross contour down and over forms. And it starts to take shape here a little bit more because you introduce the eyes in there. And I was just double checking from a different angle to make sure that the proportions are right. All in all, you're seeing this at a slightly tilted angle so the camera doesn't reflect off of the graphite. So it's a slightly different angle than the photo reference you're looking at, so it's not going to line up exactly. With the beginning of the introduction of the gouache paint, I'm establishing some planar relationships and using a chisel tip brush so I can work relatively bold and use those strokes to help communicate some of the structure, working with the form. It's a less expensive gouache. It's actually a Pelikan kit. It's got about 24 gouache colors in it, and then I have a tube of white Winsor Newton brand gouache that I supplement so it's nice and juicy out of the tube. The rest of them are built into a pan system, so they dry hard and you've got to reactivate them, pretty much like a watercolor set you might have had in grade school. So it's relatively inexpensive, but I still get some good results with it. And I've toned the background with a bluish color because I know that the figure is going to be nice and warm. I like that temperature contrast that, it's not necessarily in the photo, but I wanted to amp it up in that respect. And I'm going to go around with this similar shadow color, which is a warm version, not too cool, but in context with everything else. And I've hit some of those underplanes around the face. And I'm introducing now some of the darks in the hair to kind of key how dark can it go, at least as an initial wash. And all of these things are really initial layers. Nothing is set in stone until you start to build it up and sort of establish the opacity over top of the paper a little bit more. But you'll continue to see temperature variations throughout, which means it leans a little warmer, leans a little cooler relative to the portion of the face that I might be working on. In this case, the ear leans a little warmer. I'm undertoning the hair with a neutral color. Certainly it leans a little warm at times. Down behind the ear it's a little darker and a little cooler. As I put the whites of the eyes in, they're not pure white. They're going to remain gray so that I'm allowed to put a highlight on top of it when necessary. So it needs to have some value. And so immediately putting the dark around for the lid and the eyelashes a little bit, you start to make that white of the eye feel even brighter. So this first little section really is just about covering the paper up. I'm getting close to the value, I'm getting close to the local color, and it'll be used as a base to kind of build on top. In some cases, some of this initial layer may still be the final layer that's visible before the colored pencil, but it's not ever set in stone until we get a good picture of the whole thing. And just like the whites of the eyes, I'm tinting the teeth, not pure white. They have a little coolness, especially relative to the surrounding area. So the warmth of the skin here, the warmth of the lips will make them feel a little cooler. Now I've just introduced a little bit of cool green. You can see in the face, hopefully, that there's a little temperature change on the upper lip compared to the cheek. Cheek is very rosy, and I feel the coolness was anywhere in between the blue-green to gray region. And I like to introduce a little extra variation, honestly, in the hue. So I wanted to push it a little more green to help become a complement to the color of the lips. When we drop in the color for the nostrils, it's important to really look for the color. It's really easy to think it needs to be black or incredibly dark, but be sensitive to that. There can be more attention drawn to those regions if you're not careful. And so you'll look at paintings oftentimes and it's a very warm dark, not something that is pure black and without any color. So it may be a little bit brighter and it may be a little bit more warm and saturated than you think it actually is. I've introduced a little gradient to the shadow, something you hopefully can see in the photo as well, and contrasting that with some coolness that I see in the neck, and blending a little bit on the paper surface, working wet into wet a little bit. The interesting part about gouache is that it will reactivate and you can mix what's already existing there, which is both a good and a bad thing. Ultimately, you need to be very direct with the painting, and if you do a lot of manipulation, it will muddy the painting, it'll reactivate things when you don't want them to. So being sensitive to how much you're stroking across the paper or lifting off is really important. And I just was turning the form on the sternomastoid so that it feels like a tube, feels rounder. And I'm pushing that dark now in the background and starting to introduce some more saturated color and brush strokes, hopefully, that will give the impression that there's smaller strands of hair and such. Now it'll be a while before the entirety of the paper gets covered up, but everything that I'm doing is about establishing planes, establishing relationships of bright surface, side plane, and halftone, or shadowed area. For a lot of this, I'm using a warmer tone for our shadows, and that's helping to complement some of the cooler highlights, like the green in the hair there, which is a color that, again, I'm amping it up a little bit more than is really necessary. It's probably, strictly speaking, more of a gray, but I'm leaning it, again, green to complement those warm undertones in the shadows and warm color of the skin tone as well. Now I finally cover up that side plane of the cheekbone, and it's too bright right now, right? But we're going to watch that dry a little bit and use that as an undertone to build it a little bit darker. Bringing the brights out over top. So if you get a good base, it's sometimes 2 or 3 layers. You get a mid-tone, you get a dark, you get a light layer, and then maybe a little blend every now and then. Introducing the shadow now over the face underneath the cheekbone. And these are going to feel really dark for a while. But they are relatively dark compared to the hair, on the top side anyway. And I'm using that same color to move it around and unify it with the hair on the back of the head. As I'm getting to this stage, I'm really trying to push the value relationships to make sure that when I do need to go darker, I'm giving the brights enough play, enough room to be bright. So if I need to darken something a little bit more, make it a little bit more mid-tone, I can do that. And I'm introducing the form around the orbit of the eye with some gradients, wet into wet, meaning I'm taking a brush stroke and then carrying it out a little bit more with a different color, brightening it as it goes. I smudged my finger across the top there to give it a different texture, as well as kind of reduce the edge, soften the edge a bit. So there's a wide spectrum of hue across his face, but it's very consistent in value right now. There's a clear underplane to the jaw, casting shadow on the neck. There's a cheekbone that's in the same dark family, which is like a mid-tone right now. And the rest of it's very bright, and that's something that I'm amplifying here to effectively push the lighting a little bit more. I want it to feel a little bit more ethereal, if you will. There's a little bit of a more saturated stroke across the eyebrow to feather or connect the lighter tones with the darker tones, with a moment of saturation in between them. And when I introduce a color, I'll oftentimes look for another opportunity to use it. That builds some unity. It also reduces the amount of mixing that you have to do. Pushing the brights a little bit more. And we're really getting to the point now where I have the base undertones established. I'm going to use colored pencil to turn forms, build some transparency on top where you can see bits of color mixing in with what's below it. So I really appreciate the grain, the textural quality that gets applied over top of the flat washes of the gouache. And the gouache represents a really good surface to draw upon. It's very smooth. It receives the pencil really well. And I'm just continuing to move around. Sometimes it's very similar in color, but a different value. Sometimes it's a very similar value, but a different hue. And it's usually laid in with hatching. So it's not small little curls or circles or anything, but I'm laying in strokes. And those strokes also amplify the effect of the planar structure, the direction of the form, where is it turning away, and pushes that a little bit more clearly. In the background here, I'm kind of just pushing in more of that color, more of the same blue-gray. There's a little bit of violet on the left side. And I'm using a white pencil, really sharp, with some lost and found kind of edges. Switch to a yellow and something a little bit darker, so the hair in the back falls away a little bit more. You can overdo this a little bit, so you got to be careful. Put it away and come back if you need more. You'll see at the end, when I have a good scan of the image up, that I will be using colored pencil throughout this piece. It is not just a corrective device to fix something that went wrong or add in just a moment of change in this one little area that starts to feel different from the rest. The whole thing is unified because there's pencil everywhere, and there's gouache underneath it all. So I'm just continuing to mix back and forth, warms and cools, lights a little bit as things need to be illuminated a little bit more. I'm really softening that shadow shape that goes over the cheekbone, feathering the edges every now and then. The white pencil and the brighter pencils can oftentimes be used to smooth some of the texture out on a colored pencil drawing as well. And you'll see some of the same colors reintroduced multiple times. Here I'm really adjusting the core shadow, so that feels a little rounder on the chin. Bringing some details into the eyes. Pupil shadow from the eyelids, emphasizing the eyelashes. I'm going to let it just play out for a couple minutes here. We'll pick up with a little more voiceover at 19 minutes. What you'll find here is that I'm mixing multiple colors, including warms and cools, in the same area that build density and depth of the brights. So it's not just warm, it's not just orange, it's not just pink, it's lights and darks of both of those and all of that. And the introduction here now of a really bright white, so that I can finalize some of those values a little bit better. I know what the highlight point is. I can make assessments relative to that. Transitions between things again, between light and dark, I find a little more saturation. So look for that in the final scan. You might be able to pick up on some of that here as well. And pay attention to when I bring in those more saturated pencils, it's usually to turn the form, to bridge that light to dark transition. I'm going to take this blue pencil and move it around throughout that side to pick up the little bits of cool that bounce around in the shadow areas. Pushing the saturation between the light shape of the figure versus the darker background. A little more strength right on that edge. It's a little warmer. Deepening in around the neck. Get those forms to turn a little bit more. Now some of these darker moments under the jawline could have been accomplished with the gouache. And, there's no right or wrong reason in terms of doing that. If I needed to go darker than I have here, it should have happened in the gouache. I've sort of reached that limit where the texture could have started to become too much, where the eye gets drawn into it a little bit. And you see it a little bit more in camera right now, just based on the brightness of it. You're going to find more texture in the final scan on the face itself. And so I do feel like it still balances well and it doesn't draw too much attention yet. But it's just something you need to keep an eye on. Where do we draw our eye when we get to the textures? And where do you find the smoothness? How does it balance across your picture? In the ear now, I'm really pushing saturation, so you see a lot more orange, introducing a little bit more violet. The warmth of the capillaries and the cartilage in there really allows for a lot more saturation than in other areas. And pulling the gouache back out to opaquely paint over, so that moments that get a little complicated with the colored pencil sometimes, where the texture gets in the way, I need to flatten it out and reintroduce the gouache. So it's a little bit of push and pull every now and then. Certainly needed to go dark, and the colored pencil would have been too textural to push the hair any darker. So I wanted it to feel smooth and fall back a little bit. Less is more with the teeth. Sometimes it's just a little mark at the top where the tooth inserts into the gums, a little separation at the top. Drawing a line all the way down to define the tooth is usually too much. Less is more. Reintroducing the highlights. These are final touches, more or less. Some of the strokes across the hair up there have a nice little dry brush approach, which really helps connect the gouache painting with the colored pencil and gives you something that interprets what's happening with the hair rather than drawing every strand. Final touches with some darks, defining the eyelashes a little bit more, additional hair strands and such. I'm really being conscious of where the brightest highlights are, how those relationships fall down the shape of the head overall, the form of the head. Where's something a little glossier, where's something a little more matte. There's obviously a little bit of sheen on the cheek, but it's nowhere as bright as the forehead, or the hair, or the highlight on the ball of the nose. I like the active marks in the background. They complement the shape of the head overall, kind of circular, and introduce subtle color variation with the gray in the background gouache with some violets and blues mixed on top of it. The thing that you're not seeing on camera is my hand is full of colored pencils right now. I'll oftentimes have the entire palette that I'm working with in my hand, and I just keep swapping them in and out. And I'm continually keeping the pencils sharpened. You're not hearing or seeing me sharpen them, but I have an electric pencil sharpener that I'm using the whole time. And with that, we'll sign it and call it done. There's a good shot of the scan, and hopefully you can see the layers and textures and subtlety that starts to happen. Really pay attention to how the strokes seem to follow the form and work to build volumes as much as possible, going cross contour on the surface. And I hope you've enjoyed the demo and that you get a chance to try some of these techniques out. Look forward to seeing what people create. Bye, everyone.